We're back with part 2 of our 3D Chameleon series. Hello everyone, Chris here. Yes, we're continuing on with our 3D Chameleon series. And if you don't know what that is, it's a low-cost way to add multi-material to your 3D printer that should work on pretty much any 3D printer design. Now, with that versatility comes some challenges, so that's why we're doing all of these videos. In the last one, we took a look at the Chameleon, we actually built one of the units, and just got some general things set up so we can get ready to install it on our 3D printer. This one's going to be all about the install. The things that you have to add on your machine to make it work, as well as get the filament set up, some mounting options that you're going to have, and just the tips that I can give you to hopefully make your install as successful as possible. So let's jump right in. We're going to tackle mounting the switch that controls the Chameleon first. So for our video series, we're going to be focused on this 3D printer right here, the Prusa Mini. And there's a couple of reasons. One of them being it's a very straightforward machine and it does a really good job on its own. And it's fairly easy to add a Chameleon to, just given how it takes the filament in and how it utilizes it. It is a Bowden style 3D printer, meaning that the extruder gears that are in this housing here feed the hot end via this tube. There are some different things we have to concentrate on to get a machine like this set up. There's going to be a little difference in between a direct drive versus a Bowden, but we'll tackle that in part 3 when we start talking about the slicer. For now, we're just focused on the hardware. And really the only special sauce to making the Chameleon work is this micro switch right here. We're actually going to configure our slicer to tell the printer to go touch this switch to tell the Chameleon what to do, or what filament to start bringing in or unloading. It's all hinged on this switch right here. There are several mounts out on Printables that you can use to mount your switch, including one that's meant just for the Mini. It mounts right here on the extrusion, it's very straightforward, and you get hardware to mount the switch with your kit. Before you decide where to mount your switch, you really need to take a look at how you'd like your printer to control your Chameleon. So where does your printer have to go to touch that switch? And I found on many printer models, mounting it on the Y-axis is actually the easiest way to do it. You want to take a lot of things into consideration, like even where the wipe tower will be on the bed when you're printing. In this case for the Mini, I would recommend the wipe tower be back here. You're going to see a lot of that when we set up the G-code, but just for this video series, we're going to use our mount to mount our micro switch right here on the front extrusion. We'll just use a screw and a T-nut. You can see I've already dropped it in that slot. And the mount really isn't anything special. It's just a 3D printed part that will fit on that extrusion, but it has a spot right here where you can put your switch. Remember, there are solder joints here on the back, so it's dished out just a little bit to allow for that. But there's 2 threaded screws with your Chameleon kit that you can thread them right into the part. Remember, every part, every printer might be just a little bit different, but for the Prusa Mini, it's a fairly simplistic install. So we have our micro switch already attached to our mount. I'm just going to unplug it for now. But we'll be able to slide it right in here. And we'll just use one of the button head screws from our kit to screw the mount down. And we'll just put it in place loosely here for a moment, because we do need to make sure that this is at an exact location for the bed to be able to touch it to control the Chameleon. But after it's been mounted, we can go ahead and run our wires. I suggest you run these underneath the printer and through the bottom so you can keep the wire out of the way of that belt and idler gear. We'll just plug it in right here and kind of loop it through. Definitely consider printing out some clips or whatever mounts you need to do to make this a really clean install. But that'll get us started. In the previous video, we already tested to make sure the Chameleon was in working order. So we know that's good, but I'm just going to go ahead and plug the power into the Chameleon board so that we can get the light on the end-stop switch to show. That's going to be a good indication that it's been triggered, so we know where to position the bed to get that to trigger. I'll also go ahead and plug in the Mini and get it powered up so we can move the axes around via the LCD menu. So the build volume X and Y on the Mini is 180. So we want to use as much of the build volume as we possibly can. So I would like to be able to control this switch by going all the way 180 on Y. So bringing the bed all the way to the front. That way I know that I could print all the way back here on the back of the sheet, use the maximum amount of build volume. So when I go to 180, my max volume, that means I've triggered the Chameleon, I've touched that switch. The easiest way to keep track of where you're at, we'll just kind of move this switch out of the way. We can move it all the way to the front, and you can verify that the bed doesn't actually touch the switch at this point, which it does not. Then I'm going to go into Control, and we'll home it to make sure everything's working correctly. Make sure it goes all the way to the back. This is sensorless homing. Sometimes if there's something blocking it or you don't have it set up right, it's not homing the full build volume. So make sure that's working successfully. And when it's home, we'll just go to Move Axes. And we'll go to Y. You can see we're currently at 24 because it does actually bring it up a bit so that it can probe on the bed. But we're just going to bring it up to 180. So that's as far as it can go in the Y direction. And I'm just going to push the switch, since it's loose on that extrusion. I'm just going to push it up with my finger here until I hear it click. It clicked, it's engaged. So I'm going to be very careful and just hold that switch in this position. And then I can start moving the bed backwards. Watch your fingers, don't let that bed clip you. And when it's out of the way, then I'll tighten up this screw. Now I'm going to go ahead and verify. I'm going to go back to 180 and make sure that it's clicking that switch. You should actually hear your Chameleon start to move around or start clicking when it hits that switch. We're at 180. The switch is engaged. I can hear the Chameleon moving, and then just move back 1 millimeter to make sure it's no longer engaged. So 179, nothing's happening. 180, the switch is clicked. That's exactly where you want it to be. Now we know that we can code in the slicer to go to 180 on Y to engage our Chameleon. Now that the switch is in the location we need it to be able to utilize it with our G-code, we can go ahead and test a few things with the Chameleon, but make sure it's in the correct mode. We are going to be using the Chameleon in mode 3. There's different modes, different G-code that you can use to control it. It does a few different things, but 3 is what we're going to be focused on. To do that, you want to hold the switch until you hear 10 pulses from the Chameleon. It's actually easier if you can feel them. They're not so easy to hear, and I wish it was easier so that you could hear it on the video with me. But just hold it for 10 pulses, and then when you let it loose, you're going to get 1 pulse. There's 1. Hold it another 10 times, and you're going to get 2 pulses. That tells us it's in mode 2. And we're going to do it a 3rd time to go to mode 3. And you can actually see the cam here that does the selector on the Chameleon pulse when you're doing these counts. Let me zoom it in. So watch the selector as we hold the switch for 10 pulses. There's 10. And then it did the feedback with 3 pulses. We're in mode 3. And that's how you tell what the Chameleon's getting ready to do. So 1 pulse would be for tool 0, or the first color or material. 2 pulses, T1. 3, T2. And 4, T3. So 1, 2, 3, 4 extruders, but we're going to call them T0 through T3 because that's how it's going to call them in the G-code. So now that we've got that sorted out, we know what to look for when the printer's making decisions via this switch for the Chameleon, and we know we're in the correct mode. But just for example, right now, if I hold it, it'll start to pulse. If you let it go more than 10 pulses, it won't do anything. But there is a guide on their site what each pulse does. The 4 main transitions between the tools are very important, but there's also one where it'll hold for 7 pulses. So we'll just hold this switch and let it go 7 times. Then it's going to home the Chameleon. Then we know the selector sliders are in the correct place, so then we can enter the next command to choose which filament we want. So 7 times. We'll let loose. The unit homes, and then we're ready to start using it. That's something we're going to tackle in the Start GCode when we start building our GCode files. But from here, we can go ahead and select whichever filament we'd like to use. Let's just say we want to start using 4. We'll hold it for 4. It moves to 4. And then the next time you press it, you're going to see the extruder gears start to turn to start pulling in the 4th filament. And however long we hold it is how far we need to move the filament to be able to load it successfully. Then when you let it loose, the selector will move so that the extruder on the printer can actually start moving the filament. Then the next time we go to the switch, we'll select the next filament we'd like to use. Let's say number 2. It'll move, but now it's ready to unload the one we just last used, number 4. So if we hold it, we're backing out number 4. As soon as we're done and we let go, it'll move to be able to grab 2. We're at 2. Now we're loading number 2, and so on. So just another overview of how this thing's going to work when the printer starts moving and being able to select it from this switch. So there's the basic setup so you can start communicating with your 3D Chameleon via those button presses. And we'll build on it throughout this video, but we need to start talking about filament management. And that's the #1 thing that I can tell anyone with their multi-material setup. If you don't have it set up correctly for the unit that you're using, you're not going to be successful. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And we'll just start with the basics, starting with the filament itself. In any multi-material setup where you have to load and unload filament, you want filament that's going to be as accurate as possible. Now, I always start with Prusa Mini. I know it's very tight spec. It's always really accurate. You can actually scan the QR code to see just how accurate it is. There's lots of great filament out there, but I know 100% the Prusa Mini PLA is going to work. So that's what we're going to start with this video. We might move to something else later, but definitely consider what type and brand of filament you're going to use. Then from there, just what spool holder are you going to use for these 4 spools of filament? I highly recommend you set this up in some location where you can control all this filament management. That means someplace maybe you can mount it on a wall, or someplace more convenient where you don't have all this stuff sitting around all the time. For the video, it's going to be a little bit different, and we're just going to use this spool holder that I already had. This is actually a spool holder that came with the pallet too, that I got a long time ago, and it's pretty convenient for 4 spools. But the 3D Chameleon folks actually have a design that's very similar to this that you can print out and buy some parts to create your own. And that design is over here on Printables. If you just search for 3D Chameleon, there's lots of great parts over here. But you can print out these 2 triangle sections and use some 8mm rod to make a quick 4 spool holder. And the reason why I mention this is because there's lots of mounts available for utilizing this spool holder to mount the Chameleon as well. And the original design that I start with is this one right here. It's out there on Printables as well, but it's designed to fit on that bottom rung of that spool holder I just showed you. And you can mount those 4 front screws on the Chameleon right here on this plate, and then mount it on the spool holder. Now, I've created several different versions. This one was a little tight for my use case. I started actually installing the Chameleon on the KLP1, and this one would actually just set on top of the printer. But then I decided to go with the Mini because the setup was just a little bit easier. So what I did is take this design over here and just create a little longer one. I actually opened up this mount for the spool holder a little bit so it'd fit a little easier on the Mosaic version. But you can just mount your Chameleon on here, slip this over the bottom rung of the spool holder so that it doesn't move around when it applies torque to that filament to try to move it. So to get our Chameleon mounted, I'm just going to back out these 4 center screws. In the kit, you're going to get some longer ones. I believe these are 30s and the longer ones are 35mm. So we'll take those out and I just plan on mounting my Chameleon face down. It's not the best way to mount it for troubleshooting, but once it's up and running, it really doesn't matter. But the mount we're going to use with the spool holder that we have, it'll go on just like this. You have these larger holes that'll go over the outer screw heads, and then our longer screws will go down through the mount and hold our Chameleon. So we'll just thread these through. Remember, in the last video, I showed you what side to put your PTFE on, because we're actually loading out to the Y pipe here, and we'll bring it in through the back. So the spool holder will be on the back of the unit. But we'll just attach these, and then we can flip it over, and this will loop over our spool holder. By making it a little longer, it just gives you some room to be able to load that filament. And remember, we are backing the filament out, so there's going to be a bit of a loop back here in front of the spool. You also have a spot on this mount where you can mount your control board. Now remember, wherever you mount your control board, you want this to be a clean install, but you have to have enough length on the wire for the end-stop switch. You could always add some length to it if you'd like to. It's not going to hurt anything. But just keep that in mind, how all this is going to work in your final solution. The control board would mount right here. There's also a cover that comes with this control board when you order one, that you can just mount the whole thing through the back and put a lid on it. For now, we'll leave this loose as we start to build and troubleshoot, but that's going to be the idea of how this is set up. So from here, I've got my 4 filament spools. I actually like to feed them through the back because the filament's going to come down underneath and then into the Chameleon. That's going to be right here. The Chameleon just has a loop on it. There's no need to make it permanent. I'm just going to set it right in the center here somewhere. It fits tight on that bottom rung. Then I can feed that filament into the back of the Chameleon. And remember from the last video how this is going to work. And I highly recommend that you keep things organized. Meaning, use this as your first filament, this is your 4th one, and feed them in accordingly. The outside down here, the outside of the unit, that's T0. Above that is T1. Down here, T2, and then T3. So to feed your first filament, make sure your filament's nice and straight. You don't want your Chameleon plugged in. You don't want any energy on the motors right now, because you can do some tricks here to make this filament easier to load. Also, you want to use your cutters and make sure you have a really nice sharp angle on your filament. That's just going to help you feed it even more. So remember, we're focused on this front one down here. That's the one we want to put our first filament in. And a side tip, we're just going to thread it through the back. But if you're having problems getting it to go through over to this other side, just use your hands here to trap the filament with the slider up against that extruder gear. So for filament 1, if we push it over this way, remember the extruder gear is on the center shaft of this motor. If we push the slider towards me this way, that will trap that filament against that gear. So you have to push the top one way, the bottom one the other, because it's on that cam. But now, with it slid over like this, you're actually trapping that filament, and that extruder gear will help guide it to that front tube. So we'll just start pushing it through, and it went right through. It's hard to see because it's silver, but now we're able to start pushing it in. And we'll just leave it there for now as we load the other ones. Then we'll move to filament 2. Again, straighten it out. Then move that slider because it's on the top slider. So we'll just switch positions here. And again, that extruder gear will help keep it straight as it goes through to that front tube. After it's through, you can just move that slider to get it away from the gear and continue pushing it in, because it will be just a little bit easier. So there's the best tip that I can give you to make it easier to load your filament. So I'll just go ahead and do the other 2. So we've got all 4 started. We're in good shape. Now we'll move down to the other end of the PTFE towards the Y pipe. So here's the Y pipe that allows you to bring in multiple filaments and take it down to 1 so that you can feed your extruder. The next thing we want to be concerned about is where the filament is when we start the print. We need some sort of common length so that we know how to tell the G-code how far to push the filament in to load it. I highly recommend you use some kind of clear tape or some sort of marker that's easy to use to be able to tell where the filament is every time. And I recommend loading it 25 millimeters above these black couplers. It's just a nice number to be able to start. So I've put a piece of packing tape at 25 millimeters starting on each one of these tubes. It's kind of hard to see on the camera, but you can see that tape right here. So each one of these has a piece of tape on it. And remember, in the last video we talked about keeping things organized. This is extruder 1 or T0, 2, 3, 4, T3. It's not necessary, but for this video it's going to make it much more straightforward to explain things if we keep these organized. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue manually feeding filament 1 down to our Y pipe. We've already got a good tip on it. We should be able to go ahead and load it, but we're just going to stop right here at the end of that packing tape. Now I know this filament is loaded 25 millimeters above our Y pipe. Same with extruder 2. It's going to be much easier to see because it's that nice azure blue color. There's filament 2 right at the edge of our tape. Number 3. We've got that one loaded, ready to go, and number 4. Remember, move the sliders around on the Chameleon if it's hard to push that filament. At this point, we don't have any power energizing the motor, so it's easy to do it by hand. And there's number 4. Now the filament's all in a consistent position. It might not stay there, but we know better how to tell the G-code how long that filament path will be. Next, we need to move to the other end because we have a complete filament path here. So we have to know how far to push this filament to get it all the way down into the extruder. This is just the stock extruder PTFE piece that came with my Mini. I'll show you how to load that on the printer here in a moment. But let's just go through how to find the length of filament that you need to enter into your G-code. We'll go over this again in the G-code video, but for now, we'll just test to make sure the Chameleon is going to move the filament successfully. We'll just leave this unhooked. So we've got all our filament loaded, we're powered up, we're ready to start testing, and now we just want to make sure that the Chameleon is able to pull the filament in all the way through the Y pipe and into the extruder feed tube. Just to make sure that nothing's hung up, all the tips are going through here successfully. And this will test the whole mechanism to make sure it's set up correctly. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to hit the switch here on the printer 3 times really fast to clear it out. 1, 2, 3. That will get us back to the start where we can start entering commands. And then we're going to hold it for 7 to home the Chameleon. Now we're home. Now we can start selecting the filament that we want to load. So we'll just start with 1. 1 hit, and then if you hold it, that'll load filament 1. And I just want to get it loaded all the way through the Y adapter and into the feed tube for the extruder. Make sure there's no hang-ups. And we'll do all 4. So then we'll select 2 hits. That will put you in the mode to back out 1. We'll back it out to our 25 millimeter mark. And then let it go and then hold again, and we'll start loading 2. That one's good. We'll test 3. 1, 2, 3. Unload. Load 3. That one's good. And then 4. Unload 4. Unload 3, sorry. Back to the mark. Then load up 4. So we're good. All the different filaments are loading successfully through our whole filament path. And I'll just go ahead and select 1 again so that I can unload 4 and get it back to the mark. Anytime you start a print, we're going to set up that start G-code so it homes and resets. So you'll be back at square one anytime you want to start that print. So I'm happy with this test. We should be able to print. Now we have a long way to go and a few more things to tackle. So at this point I'm pretty confident in the loading of the Chameleon. Everything's working okay, but we do have to load it to the extruder gears. And on the Mini, the feed tube just goes in the side here. So this is just going to press in the side of this plastic housing, and you want to make sure it's in there on the Mini all the way so that it's as close to those extruder gears as it can possibly be. You might have to force it a little bit. That PTFE tube's a little slick, but you can get it in there. Now we need to measure how far it is from our 25mm mark here that we're used with the tape all the way to those extruder gears. And we're going to do this again in the GCode video, but just to get you started, I like to use one of the longer filament paths, and I'm just going to unhook this coupler, and we're going to feed in a piece of filament. So we'll just feed it in, and we'll feed it all the way to the extruder gears until it stops. And on the Mini, you can actually verify that by just turning this gear up here by hand if you'd like to see it grip, see if it's gripping the filament. But once you're satisfied that it's at the gears, just hold it here or mark it with a pen, and then measure the length that you pulled out. You can see ours is right at 260mm, and then you would add that 25mm of gap at the top of the Y pipe to that. So 285 is our number. So the Chameleon actually loads the extruder, it pushes the filament based on time. So we like to go per second, how fast can it feed? And through all of my testing, I think the Chameleon is capable of doing about 34mm of filament per second. So with our 285 number, I actually like to divide that by 34. So that tells me I need about 8.3 seconds of load time, so I would start with an 8 in the GCode configuration on the 3D Chameleon site. This is the Mode 3 calculator. So what you would do is find the axes that you mounted your button. We were on the Y. Where is it? It's at 180, like you just saw. Back out distance in seconds. We're going to start with that 8 seconds based on our 285 measurement. And then you need one more measurement from the extruder gears to the hot end. And you can do that with the filament measurement method again. You can kind of put it down here by the extruder gears. We're just roughing in the numbers. We're going to have to tweak it after the fact anyway, but you can use this for your filament path and just see how long this piece of filament is. Now what we're going to do in the third video in this series is actually use the extruder to jog filament until it starts extruding. And we'll use that step count or millimeter count to use in our calculator. But that's going to be a little bit later. A side tip while we're here though, if you ever want to load just one filament into your Chameleon, say you want to do a quick print and you don't want to have to load the Chameleon, you can just use the printer. There is a pass-through in the center of this Y that you can put any filament in you wish just to load that single for a one-time use. That can be really handy, and we can use it while we're calibrating. So just a side tip there. I didn't know that was there until recently, so pretty handy. And the last tip for today while we get into testing. We're getting ready to do all this calibration, tip tuning, all this good stuff. But just for now, I suggest you keep these PTFE tubes in order and as flat as possible. It's going to take up quite a bit of room. You could shorten these up. This part right here really doesn't matter how long it is. But with the Mini going in the side like this, we can get a pretty straight shot from our filament over to the printer, no problem. It is totally capable. The Chameleon can really pull some filament. It's got a lot of torque. You can use these in an ARC configuration, no problem. But until we get everything dialed in, again, I recommend leaving it laid out so we can see exactly what's going on. And then we're going to get into all the fun stuff. So we're pretty much ready to go. We can start testing soon. We have to tune the filament tips to make sure that we can load them and unload them successfully, but most of the hardware has been taken care of. But there is one thing that's specific to multi-material setups when you're utilizing one nozzle, meaning not multiple tool heads, that you might want to consider because you have to unload that filament, and that's some sort of filament buffer. And those of you that are new to these setups, let me show you what I mean. I haven't considered one yet, what style it might be for the Chameleon, but I am considering making one. You can see already we have some filament mess back here. There's a lot of different solutions like filament rewinders, spools that automatically go backwards, they keep some tension on the filament, but there's also just what they call a buffer. So you're printing, you bring one of these filaments in to load into your extruder. So it goes in. You're done with it, you have to back that filament out. And you can't put it back on the spool naturally. It has to have some place to go. So with a rewinder, that would help you put it back on the spool. Or you can have a little side cartridge that it stores the filament in. It keeps it safe so it doesn't get hung up on any of the other filaments or any of these other mechanisms, causing an issue. Because remember, with the Chameleon, even one little issue, if something doesn't load correct one time on a multi-hour print, it's going to ruin the print, and we don't want that. So a buffer is probably something we need to consider, or at least keep that in mind when you're putting together your setup. Wherever you mount your spools, make sure you have some room for that returning filament when it puts it back after it's been using it. Something we'll keep in mind during our install in all these videos, we might want to put in some sort of buffer into this whole setup. So there we go. Things with the 3D Chameleon are starting to get just a little bit real. The first video we went deep dive on the hardware. Now we see how everything's set up and how the printer is going to utilize that hardware. And we're starting to talk about material management, which is going to be really important. We have to have a pretty fail-safe setup here to be able to utilize the Chameleon. Because remember, the printer doesn't really know about it being multi-material. And if there's one little hiccup during a multi-hour print, that's going to ruin the whole thing. We don't want that, so we have to have everything very precise before we jump into this. We've got a long way to go as far as tuning in GCode and getting all the slicer settings just perfect, but it will be on future videos. That's it for today. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.